let me read the description. At a panel at Arisia 2013, Andrea Hairston said, "I can only tell you a story if you're a human who can hear a story and imagine what it's like to be someone who isn't human." Tannanarive Due added that access to stories matters. Some children, for instance, can easily find books about characters like themselves, while others have to read books from outside the position of identification. Culture creates structures of identification and empathy, or to put it another way, ways of feeling from within and ways of feeling from without. How do stories create structures of feeling? And how can writers and readers both benefit from awareness of these structures? So I'd like to start, before we get into it, by having the panelists each introduce themselves, and then we'll get down to it. Walt, do you want to start?
Oh God, there's nothing worse than being first in the big room first thing in the morning. Hi, I'm Walt Williams. I'm an author with Dragonwell Publishing. Just came out this past August, The Garden at the Roof of the World. I'm also an anthropologist, and I manage information security for a company not too far from here. So I wear many hats, and I like to weave many of those hats into my stories. Incidentally, they are selling this next door, I'm obligated to say, like, please come by. Please come by. And I'm doing a reading tonight, and I'm hoping for some people in my room. As for why I'm here, well, obviously, I'm a sad, sorry sort, and I desperately need your care. And I pull tricks like that when doing characters in order to make people care. And I'm here to talk about how you can care about horrible people like myself and other people we weave into stories.
Wow. Should I go after that?
I hope so.
I'm Andrea Hairston, and I'm the guest of honor here this year, so I'm very excited to be here. These are my books. This is my latest one with Aqueduct Press. This is plays and essays and a speech that I made at WisCon, and then my other novels. And most of my work is about trying to have empathy with people who are different from one another. So that's my task as a writer, to figure out how to translate ourselves to one another and then recreate a world in which we can all communicate and develop. So I think that that's what I'm working on in my life. So that's why I said, yes, I'll be on this panel.
I'm Julia Rios. I am an editor for Strange Horizons, which is an online magazine. I also just finished co-editing this anthology, Kaleidoscope, which officially comes out in August. It is diverse YA science fiction and fantasy stories. And I also am co-editing another project called In Other Words, which is a chapbook of flash fiction and poetry by people of color that all the proceeds will go to support Connor Bust, which helps people of color attend conventions. So all of these projects that I edit all focus on diversity and getting different voices to be heard and tell their stories, because I deeply believe that we're all human and we all need to learn to understand people who are not exactly like us.
I'm Matthew Kressel, and primarily a short story writer. My most recent story is The Meeker and the All-Seeing Eye in Clark's World in the May issue. And my story, The Sounds of Old Earth, was nominated for a Nebula Award this past year. For me, I approach all stories with the intention of conveying an emotion to the reader, and I think that's how I would approach this panel here as well.
So, Andrea, I'd like you to start by elaborating, please, on your statement about who can hear stories and imagine being someone they aren't. Is this ability culturally informed or nuanced, or is it something inherent in the individual?
Okay, I think it's not necessarily inherent in the individual, it's inherent in the species. It's inherent in our biology that we are actually set up to be able to play across difference. so that we as mammals respond to the sounds of other mammals, and we can sort of imagine or create a mindscape of what they might be going through. So you can hear the sounds of dogs and chipmunks and whales and various creatures, and you try to figure out, what are they feeling? What's going on? When the elephants are weeping, scientists actually said, oh, they're not really weeping. Really? And then they did more research and they went, oh, I think they're weeping. So that the capacity to feel another across great difference from elephant to dog, elephants and dogs often connect, is part of being who we are in the universe. So that as human beings, we also tell stories. Like I try to imagine what's going on inside of you as you sit in your position, as you do your stuff. And I do that below consciousness. I do that without thinking. In fact, I have a whole sort of schema of what I think you must be feeling, thinking, and I jump to that conclusion. Woo! Before I have had a conscious moment to assess that. Like, am I imposing my story on your gesture? So here is where culture plays, I think, a very strong role. So I have a set of schemas that I, frames that I frame the world with that are primarily unconscious. So when I meet something that is different, I assume that it's like me. And I say assume, because it's unconscious. And I map you, and I know you, and I respond to you from my cultural perspective, which are those schemas that are laid on top of my biological capacity. And then what I next must do is say, whoa, wait a minute. Are you really, back to the elephant weeping? Am I imposing, anthropomorphizing the elephant? Or am I being an objective scientist who views animals as black boxes? Or am I actually experiencing the, connection between two beings with similar realities? And that is the question that we often, sometimes people call that political correctness recently, as opposed to mindful, thoughtful evaluation of the cognitive unconscious. So, is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's sort of the theoretical base on which we can operate. Do certain stories or ways of telling them encourage or not identification or empathy? Matt, would you comment that?
Yeah, I feel that, as Andrea said, there are different cultural constructs, and that in certain situations, our assumptions about what the other might feel could be wrong. But on the other hand, I do believe that there are certain base emotions that all humans share. So I think, from a story perspective, from a writing perspective, I will often start off a story with a very approachable emotion, and then as the story progresses, you will learn more about the culture of that character and their individual circumstances, and then you can explore some of those nuances that if you started the story with those nuances, the reader may not connect, or not all readers would connect. So I think it's important when you're trying to draw the reader in to at least work with feelings that we can grab onto immediately and go from there.
Walt?
It's funny, as I'm thinking about elephants weeping, I'm thinking of Baba and how he started out as a poor orphaned elephant, and the capacity of our children to empathize with other is most effective when you give them an other that is a non-human, where they can play off the this person is so unlike me that they're like me. But there isn't an element of reserve and fear that we reserve for others of our own species. And so often when we encounter the other inhuman, that's where we've been taught from birth to put up guards and put up walls and, oh, there's the stranger, they are dangerous. They could do something that is unexpected, that you don't see in children's literature when they anthropomorphize the character through an animal. And I think one of the tricks that authors do in general, as we teach our children to encounter other in literature, is by doing that with animals, you're teaching them that difference doesn't have to be frightening. And that's one of the greatest hurdles to overcome. And then they could use that as a reader as they grow. They've already been conditioned that some differences can be okay, and they can broaden that to start to approach the differences of dealing with people who come from other places.
So I'm hearing a lot about making people sympathetic. I was thinking a lot about stories I've read where characters aren't necessarily sympathetic, and we still want to be able to connect with them. And I think one of the things that happens is you can use deep point of view, where you get really far inside someone's point of view, and then you'll start to empathize with them. And then when you see the differences that maybe you don't even sympathize with, it helps you to understand a bit of the motivation, and that makes them feel more real, and that makes the conflict of the story and the struggles that are going on you feel it more deeply. And I see authors doing that to really great effect. One of the things that I thought of immediately was Beloved by Toni Morrison. In the opening of that book, you have a black slave woman who is running away, and she meets a pregnant white woman. And this pregnant white woman is a nice pregnant white woman, and she needs help. And the black slave woman is sort of like, do I help her, even though she's a nice pregnant white woman? Or do I just try to keep running because my life is in danger, and whether or not I help her, it's going to hurt me? And that teaches the white reader to look at themselves from the other perspective, but they're so deep in her point of view that they can really see some of the things about them that even if they have good intentions might not make them a sympathetic character. And I think that's really key.
I couldn't agree more. If you wouldn't mind interjecting here quickly. I'm thinking of main character in the leader, whose name is escaping me, begins with an H. Abstractly one of the most abstractly one of the most despicable kind of people you'd ever meet, but because you're placed so deep in his sincere longing, first thing in the book, that kind of repulsiveness can become sympathetic, even though
To some folks.
yeah.
Never really warmed to that character. Just saying.
Well, I think that it goes to this idea that there are pockets of empathy. And, I'll give you an example. How many people in this room have a cat? How many people love cats, right? And how many of those people in this room also eat meat? And, so you choose one animal for your beloved friend, and then, not even think about it and go for the steak for dinner.
Chop that chicken.
And we have these pockets of empathy that we're not aware of. And I think that as a writer, I find these pockets really fascinating. It's like what you were going with that story with the woman who escaped slavery and finds the pregnant white woman, where like the overlap of these pockets of empathy can create really interesting tension in a story.
So Andrea, because of your history as an actor and a theater person, you deal with this all the time, don't you?
Yeah, so
the walls.
Well, one of the things that James Baldwin said was that no man, and he said man, is an enemy to himself. So if you play a character, you can't comment on the character, right? You can't say, ooh, what a despicable character that person is in Lolita. You have to play that character from the point of view that the character, might have some doubts about him or herself, but basically is not the enemy. So that you must find a way to make a bridge from self to other. That's what Andrea Smith says in her acting theory. That you don't comment on or go, I know they're evil. That's called bad acting, right? If you do that, you will fail. And in particular, I think I've mentioned, perhaps you've heard me before, Andrea Smith, in her pieces, she plays, 20 or 30 different people who none of whom agree. They have very different worldviews, and they disagree with each other, because she often plays people who disagree with each other, one right after another, saying really intense things about each other, and she plays them all. So, and watching that, you are struck by what I think, Matthew, the pockets of empathy. Because each character is despicable, each character is lovable, each character is crazy, each character is brilliant. Because she believes that every human being has a bit of poetry, and if they talk long enough, they'll do their poetry. And she will pick their poetry to perform. And then she will juxtapose it to that other person's poetry. And those may clash. But she believes in their perspective on the world deeply as she performs it. And so I think that's one of the, this is not typecasting, you know, which is, I think, a fairly recent practice in theater and then in film. This is the back to what I was saying about playing others. That's the impulse of theater, to understand, to go from self to other, to understand what you are not. And so you play at it, you perform it, you become it. And then, you know, you might not quite reach it, but you have another understanding of someone who is the villain or the good person or whatever that you are not.
So, for a long time, writers were encouraged to, especially in writing fantasy and science fiction, to have unmarked characters. You know what an unmarked character is? No. It's sort of what used to be taken as the standard human being, white male, middle class.
The default setting.
The default setting, right. Because you wouldn't notice the character and everybody could identify with that character. And I think that's what Tannanarive is talking about in her quote about access to stories. Children can easily find books about characters. Some children can't find books about characters like themselves and have to read books from outside a position of identification. So, you know, as a girl, of course, when I was growing up, most of the stories I was reading were about boys, and and the girl becomes a boy, sort of, in her head while she's reading this story. So the black child becomes white, and so on and so forth. So do you think this is true, that it's easier for readers to identify with unmarked characters?
God, no. I think it's easy for a reader to identify with a passionate character or with a sincere character, but thinking about myself as a kid, I read up Pippi Longstocking just as easily as I read up just about any other person, and it didn't matter that Pippi was a girl and I was a boy. It wasn't a challenge to me. She was a great character who was sincere and passionate and comfortable with who she is. I think it becomes a problem when you come across a character who hates themselves. I was thinking back to your comment. People hate themselves. Characters don't tend to. Characters tend to be very, very comfortable in their own skins, except the villains, who sometimes aren't, and that's what us writer people use to make villains sympathetic, because if they're not comfortable in their own skins, maybe, just maybe, they're not fully on the dark side. And so we use dichotomies like that in order to trick people into being sympathetic with the villain. And we use things like that to not so much trick people, but to help people along in the process of being sympathetic with somebody who's completely different, because they're sincere in their difference, they're passionate in their difference, they're whole in their difference, they're not torn apart in their difference, they're not the victim.
Any reactions to that?
Well, I just want to say that one of the problems is that the default setting is also unconscious. So I hear you saying that you are comfortable with women protagonists, but unfortunately, like for instance, there are no plays by women on Broadway like this year, or scheduled to be, just to follow up with what you're saying. And the number of women characters is pathetic. So we're used to all of us seeing the world through the universal male. through the universal white male, through the able-bodied, et cetera, right? So that's what we measure every character by, without thinking about it. So that when we get a character who's not in that, that character is not as real. So realism is what you're willing to believe. And we are willing to believe the broad expanse of white male experience. We will accept all variations. Whereas for other characters, it's a narrow. It's much more limited what we will believe. And story is based on what we have heard before, the iterations. So we like the new, but the new is sitting on top of basically a whole realm of stuff that we take for granted. So that characters can be judged as impossible. Like, no, that would never happen. In fact, when I sent out my first novel, Mindscape, or no, when I sent out Redwood and Wildfire, everybody said, with one exception, everybody said, oh no, this is like impossible. No one is going to believe these characters. Who are those characters? Now, I am the scholar of theater from the late 19th century, early 20th century, but they are telling me this shit didn't happen. I'm like, no, excuse me, I'm the one who knows what Native Americans and African Americans and Irish Americans were doing in the late 19th and early 20th century. Oh, no, they wouldn't be doing it. And they were telling me because we actually believe that we know, everything that we don't know, right? We think that what I know is truth. So if I have never heard of this thing, it probably didn't happen. And that's a secret thought. So you have to regularly say, wait, do I really know that? Did I choose to know that? Or did that seep in from the iterations of stories that I've heard before? So the default setting is deeper than just our consciousness. So that we're not, seeing the world as a universal expression of an Indian woman or a woman from India, which word was I using there, right? So we're not ready for whatever perspectives their particular cultural framework will bring that are going to be different than what we've heard before. So somehow, like Matthew was saying, we have to figure out a way, whoever, because we all have the white male reader in our mind, so we have to talk to that person to convince them that this person is worthy of, your attention, the story, and it's enormously exhausting, I find, because I don't really want to do that. I want to talk to the reader that's me, in my brain. I don't want to be talking to this other, default setting audience, So
would you say that just adapting the ordinary narrative structures used for the default setting isn't going to be enough to work?
Well, I find that I actively work against the default setting, but I think that you hit on something that a lot of what we do is subconscious, and a lot of our assumptions about characters and their interactions with their environment comes from what we've read and absorbed, and we may not realize that we're working in the default mode. So I consciously try to act against it when I write, unless I'm specifically trying to do it, a white male character. And even though I'm working, trying to create a character very different from that base, my assumptions about the starting point and the ending point could be based on, could be skewed one way or another, especially if you're from another culture and you're reading that and you're like, well, no, that's not quite right. So I think it's a struggle, but I think that, bringing it into consciousness, actively working to try to, there's nothing wrong necessarily with the default mode. I don't think anyone's saying that. It's just saying like the making the assumption that everyone would connect with this. That's.
But also, of course, the default mode encourages certain stories and makes others invisible. And so one of the questions here is accessibility to different kinds of stories. Julia?
Yeah, so I really want to follow on this unconscious assumptions and things. Because one of the things that I do is I'm a podcaster and I participate in the Skippy and Fantasy Show, which is a general science fiction and fantasy podcast. And this year, we've been trying to take an SF world tour where we talk to people who are in fandom and writing and other things all over the world and find out about what science fiction and fantasy are like in the places where they come from. And over again, we always ask them what they grew up reading and how they got interested in science fiction and fantasy. And almost every single time, they say most of what I read was British or American. And it doesn't matter where they come from, that's what they read. And so we've gotten people who live in places that are completely different to rolling green pastures full of sheep, who will say things like, when I started writing, it was really hard not to set everything I wrote in a rolling green pasture full of sheep. So I think it's really important to know that that does, it absorbs into your personality on a very deep level. And then you have to talk to that person, and that person is partly inside you.
One of the things that I found when reading Garden here is that none of my characters were the default white male. All of my main characters are women, one of whom comes from India. Now, the book is set about 900 years ago. So here I am trying to get into the mindset of a woman ascetic from India 900 years ago. And that starts with forcing me to really step outside of myself. I did an awful lot of reading, awful lot of research, trying to capture how somebody like that might have thought. Now, everybody's different, so I can only approximate reality. But as you as an author look to write somebody who's very different than yourself, one of the things I found was so important to me in trying to capture that authenticity, making these people come alive seem real, was they had to be well-grounded, not in the history that we assume, but in the history of, in her particular case, how somebody would have thought in her culture. So I needed to understand cultural reactions. I needed to understand cultural thought patterns. And doing that research allowed Kavundi to come alive. And Kavundi, when she steps onto the page for the very first time, is very much not the default. I have yet to meet anyone who's read my stories that said that Kavundi was a problem for them because she was so outside the default of what you expect in medieval fantasy or in medieval adventure stories. So it's up to us as authors when we're writing to force ourselves very much out of the default, to take the time to do some research, to read literature from those cultures, to read plays from those cultures, to look at the art from those cultures, to read the philosophy of those cultures, and then to remember that everything that we're reading is just scraping the layer. You're only getting to see the perspective of people who had the leisure to write, people who had the leisure to draw, and being honest that you can only approximate reality and not try to pretend that this is reality.
I'd like to go back to the accessibility question, which I didn't answer at all.
Yeah.
And say that part of the problem is, of course, not having enough of it out there and not having enough of it visible.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are doing really good work in trying to make that sort of thing more visible, especially in YA right now. There's We Need Diverse Books campaign and Diversity in YA. And both of those, We Need Diverse Books is largely on Twitter and Facebook, and they're making sure that they get the hashtag to spread and promote more diverse work. And Diversity in YA has a blog and a Tumblr, and Melinda Lowe and Cindy Pon are collecting a lot of stats and showing just what the numbers are in mainstream publishing for books with characters who have, written by people of color, and the characters are people of color or have a disability or are not straight. There are any number of ways that you could be a non-default character, and there aren't as many books out there as there could be. And this is where I think the small presses are coming in and trying to pick up some of the slack. This is why Andrea had Redwood and Wildfire produced through Aqueduct Press, which it's a beautiful book and it's wonderful, and it's unfortunate the mainstream publishers weren't willing to take the chance on it.
The risk.
Well, this is why we need Strange Horizons.
Well, yeah, and that's Strange Horizons, Kaleidoscope, Aqueduct Press, cross genres. There are lots of smaller presses that are doing really good work in trying to get that stuff out there. And I think that's part of it.
Could we talk a little bit more about, or actually we haven't talked about this, about ways of telling stories that, are there ways of telling stories about non-default characters that have a greater chance of success than others?
Well, I think I hesitate from passing judgment. So, because I'm waiting for the story to enchant me. So, I think partly.
But as a storyteller yourself, do you find certain approaches work better than others?
So what I was about to say is that the way I tell a story depends on what the story is. When I'm working out the story, I'm working out the way of telling it, and the story itself demands, like, oh, this character is this, their struggle is that, and I'm a dramatic storyteller, so I know that I'm looking for the drama. And for me, drama isn't just, things blow up, which some people often think I need that. Or melodrama, like, oh my God! I'm not necessarily interested in that, but I am interested in change, in how we get from this state of being to another state. And so, and what are the things that allow change or prevent change? So that I find as I tell my stories, and some people get mad, I don't necessarily share everything about the characters right at the beginning. So people think I'm trying to trick them, that I don't tell them that this character is actually a woman, and they assume it's a man, or this character is actually one race or many races when you thought it was this other race. So that I don't necessarily, on stage you actually see people, but I delight in the fact that you can't quite see the people yet. So you have this wonderful set of mysteries that you can work with that when I'm on stage I can't work with. So I want to work with those. Because, if not, why not write a play, right? Like, let's work with what you can do in the context of fiction. So I think that's what it is, because I'm writing a screenplay now, and I don't have that, because unless I put them in the shadows, you see the body, and the body is very present in film or theater. But here I can reveal the body, and therefore I can use that as a way of letting people know what they might assume, before they've even seen the character, and how that works. So that's one of the things actually that I like about fiction, that I love about fiction, is the layers of mystery that you can use. Because in theater, I have this other thing where I can do simultaneity. I can have music and dance and props and costumes. You can't do that. You have to go one word at a time. So when I'm working with a play, then I try to figure out how I can do the mystery using simultaneity, using all of those diverse things to again reveal things that you might not have been aware of. But I'm doing it differently because it's a film or because it's a play. So does that? Yeah. Okay.
I think if you're writing a character, you have a story, and if the character may be very different from the default mode, and or very different from your reader's culture, what would help, at least in my experience, is working with an emotion or a feeling, try to generate that in the reader that they can connect with at first, before you diverge into the specific cultural elements, story elements that a reader would have a harder time identifying with. I think once you get that base, like, okay, this person feels compassion for a sick animal, or something like that, and then you get like, okay, I can get that, and then as you branch off into these other areas, you have that starting off point to generate that connection with the reader, and hopefully, if you're telling a good enough story, you can continue that connection as you go forward.
I definitely agree with that. I think that if you can find a way to tap into the reader's emotion and hook them into some kind of aspect, whether it's compassion for animals or a conflict, like are they fighting for their family, Most people have at some point had conflict within their family. If they tap into that, they'll be interested in the journey, and then that pulls them into everything else, and they'll be willing to listen to more than they might have before.
Absolutely. Though one way that you can convey a sense of difference is looking for the different kinds of things somebody from a different culture or a different background would notice, and make certain that your character notices these things. People from different backgrounds, people from different societies do care about different things from their own cultural frameworks. So make it a point of having your character notice those things, having your character clue into something, react to something that is not in the default, as a way of drawing the reader into the thought processes of the character. And that forces you as the writer to try to notice all of these things that are culturally bound within the culture of whatever individual you're trying to write. In the case of Kavundi, she was a mystic, so I had to force myself to pay attention to Hindu spirituality, and God help me, I don't know how I did that. In the case of Sorcerer, who's a hacker in the story I'm writing right now, he would notice all the security cameras in the room. He would notice the places where you could hide things. He would notice that somebody had put a hole in my cup, and be hysterical about that because of his own subcultural heritage.
I think the reverse could also be true. What someone doesn't notice can also tell you a lot about the character.
Absolutely. That they don't notice the herd puppy along the side of the road says a lot about someone.
Well, and also, I like multiple points of view. Back to Anna Devere Smith. So I can have someone have, the default setting, fine, and then some other point of view not have that, and the juxtaposition of those characters is interesting to me as a reader, and therefore I want to figure out how to make that work without overwhelming the audience. And I said to someone, well, Game of Thrones, how many point of view characters are there? There are like billions of them, and people have no problem with that. But when you have a few point of views that are not normal, that seems to be problematic, as opposed to the range of points of view that he's working with in his fiction that are familiar. So it's familiar points of view, I guess. This is what someone was saying to me. I have yet to plow through all of the points of view, even though I've done quite a few of them. But juxtaposition works really well because what I think, it's like relativity, like where do I stand, and therefore what matters to me. And then someone standing seemingly in the same place sees a different world, has a different perspective. So one of my techniques as a writer is to juxtapose point of view. And even start with an alien one at some point, which is a risk, because you could alienate people starting with an alien.
But aren't aliens, in a way, more like the animal, creating pockets of empathy because they are so different from us that...
Well, and animal stories weren't always children's stories. I know you were talking about that, but many, every culture, animals, again, back to what I was saying earlier, we identify with animals, all kinds of animals, and then use them as metaphors as we map the world. So we have, decided that we've grown up and we're mature now. We don't need to do that, but in fact, we continue to do it. So that when we relate through animals or aliens or all of those creatures, we're really trying to map the world and then use something that is not, threatening. Because aliens don't threaten.
That's what I was getting at.
Right, non-threatening alienness, that allows us then to deal with it in ourselves.
Aliens can become the objects of our fear. I'm thinking of all the 1950s bug-eyed monster stories.
But those were definitely about what was going on.
Right, absolutely.
Yes.
They absolutely were. And when you write the alien as other, when the alien is another character in the story whose point of view you never get to share, that alien can very represent the object of fear. The challenge is to get yourself into the alien's point of view so that you can, even though there's nothing human about this, you can start to understand how they perceive this shared reality that we all interact in. And even though it's a horrific set of stories, and none of the characters are people I would ever want to associate with, Stephen Donaldson's 4-volume set in the far distant future, whose books I'm completely forgetting the names of, do an absolutely fantastic job of actually putting you in the head of something completely non-human and getting you to relate in that. And he shocks you into that by having one of the most non-human points of view that you approach being from a human who's doing inhuman things.
But this actually sort of underscores the irony of the problem, say, Andrea finds with people not wanting to risk having those stories directly about the non-default set of characters.
And I noticed that you have James Baldwin, and I didn't notice that when I quoted him. So
yes. Actually, there is a quote here
because he talks about that.
From 1961. Hold on, here. So he's talking about black people in the theater and the awful roles there are for them to play. So he, and of course he uses the word Negro because it's 1961. And now here he is once more, the black actor, facing an essentially ignorant and uncaring white man or woman, the casting director, who may allow him to play a butler or a maid in the show being cast. He dissembles his experience in the office, and he knows that he will probably be lying about it on stage. He also knows why. It is because nobody wants to know the story. It would upset them. To begin analyzing all of his probable reactions would take all of the space of this magazine and then some. But resentment is compounded by the fact, as a Negro actress once observed to me, that not only does the white world impose the most intolerable conditions on Negro life, they also presume to dictate the mode, manner, terms, and style of one's reaction against these conditions. And so, in a way, this goes back to the whole issue of these stories and access to stories. He's saying that in order to have acceptable stories about black people in 1961, you basically have to lie about your own experience.
And or you won't get produced.
Or you won't get produced.
Yeah.
And of course,
that's
this
still
is
true.
the case for,
Sorry,
right.
I know we're talking about 1960, but
Right.
really,
It's still
when I
true.
said there were hardly any, plays by women, there are no plays by Asian, no plays by Native Americans, no play, there just aren't.
And they go to movies.
And then movies are even more plays. There are huge numbers by women and people of color. Films, women, who win Oscars have like half the screen time than men who win Oscars. Just, all of those wonderful numbers, statistics that I love, really let you know if you just watch what women do on screen is they do social labor. They respond, they react, they weep. They are not taking action. So if you just analyze films from that perspective, you find that women go, and they win an Oscar.
Stories we know about women
are therefore that. So if you write a woman who's not doing that, people think, well, that's not a real character. You're not doing good character work. Where's the weeping, moaning, relating, where's all that? Because, if she can't heave her breath, can she win?
But in fact, of course, I would argue that there are people who know those stories and want those stories, which is why we why I have
right.
Aqueduct Press. But so I want to
actually, women win offered like, there's one that Emma Thompson did the film of it. It became a play, and she has cancer, and I can't think of the... Wit. Okay, Wit was turned down. The writer is from Smith College. She was a teacher. She sent out her script. It was turned down by every literary manager of a professional theater that it reached, except for one in Connecticut. And all of the literary managers said, well, nobody would be interested in this story. What is this story? This is ridiculous. We're not going to do this. We can't do it. It's well written. But, you know, and it would just be a bomb. But not Hartford Stage, Longworth said, we'll do it. You know, and they did it, and it went on, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and people went to it in droves, and Emma Thompson made a film of it, which was wildly popular. And all the literary managers, I was at a meeting where they're scratching their heads, and they go, we just don't know why, you know, people would be interested in this character. The primary people who go to plays, women. The largest demographic is women. And all the women who went to the play loved the play and found, you know, the revelations and all the stuff. So they went in droves and brought their friends and brought other men who, guess what? They loved the play too. They were as interested as the women in the play. And the literary managers assumed they would not be. So they made the false assumption that no one would be interested in a woman dying of cancer who was an English professor. I mean, yeah, boring.
I think that gets to that default audience assumption that we were talking about earlier. It's really a challenge, not so much within, there are plenty of people who are writing. There are plenty of people who are writing the other. People are not doing market research. People are presuming who the audiences are, whether or not we're discussing novels, plays, movies. We're an industry that goes on tradition rather than
on like mathematical facts, statistics. Women playwrights do better than male playwrights, right? So if you do a play by a woman, odds are you'll make more money. That doesn't matter. You still can't get your plays done, and someone argues that women have to be like 25,000 times better. So by the time they get their plays in front of a literary manager, it is, you know, wildly better than something that you'll take a risk on. You'll take a risk on a man, but not on a woman. And even with these statistics, it's very difficult to get your play done. It's and your film, whoa. Same thing in film, too.
This is also reminding me, last night I was on a Latino roundtable of speculative fiction, and we were talking about Junot Diaz, who said, you know, you can have 10 million lines of an Elvish song, and people will read that with no problem, but you put a few words of Spanish in it, and they're like, nope. That, people will not connect with that. It has foreign language.
Okay, I want to open
Elfish is not threatening. Spanish is.
We're running out of time, but please, if anyone has, yes.
I actually want to ask what you think of first person as a technique for identification. Because for me, it's interesting. I wrote a novel with four-person protagonists, and the people who have read it connect most strongly with the third-person characters, not with the first person. So, and that seems very counterintuitive to me.
Oh,
so I'm
that's my
wondering.
I think first-person narrative can often hide certain mistakes that you would make in the story, because you could say, oh, those are just quirks of the character and not necessarily of the writing. It can be used to more closely identify with the character. But it's also difficult in terms of point of view if you need to broaden out a little bit. Like if you're stuck in a first-person point of view, it can make certain things difficult. But in my experience, I find that sometimes, yes, it's easier to identify with the character in first person.
Easier, I didn't hear the end.
Easier to identify with a character written in first person than third. Not necessarily always.
It depends on the reader.
It depends on the reader, and also depends on the storyteller.
I've been reading a lot of Hemingway as I prepare to write novels set in that period of time. And his work tends to be very, very first person. And in reading it, I'm finding that it actually distances me more from the character than it brings me into the character. Mainly because I'm too involved in that character and within the story. All I'm getting is their thoughts. I'm not getting anybody else's perspectives on them. In a third-person narrative, I'm able to see them from the outside as well as from the inside. And so I often, as a reader, find that that gives me a more holistic appreciation of who that person is, because I'm not just seeing them from who they think they are. I'm getting a chance to see who others within the stories think they are, as I get those other perspectives that you were talking about that can be so valuable. So having an outside perspective on a character can really help you understand who that person is, because you're not just dealing with who they think they are.
I'm from the theater. It's all first person. So for me, it's very interesting. I think of myself as translating first person to third person, but secretly it's all first person. But the trick is juxtaposition. So you juxtapose all the first persons, because that's what you do in theater and film. You have, the objectivity is achieved by having people who are, you should not have like, oh, this is the right person speaking and this is the wrong person speaking, and your dialogue is then between the right and the wrong. No. You really, the Socratic method, you really have to have equal opponents, we'll put that in quotes, or otherwise you have boring drama. They smack you down and, well, there's no drama there. So really, you have to be able to juxtapose characters who are equal to one another and can tangle and wrangle. So that even when I'm writing third person, I'm secretly doing my, this is a monologue that this person is thinking and feeling and doing, and now I'll translate it into third person, and then I will juxtapose it so that we have the multiple perspectives on whatever is going on. So I don't, and when I read, I think I'm reading as theater. So I'm performing each of the characters as I read. So to me, it almost doesn't matter what person it's in, it's what matters in. It's how well it's written. How well the characters
One last
written.
question.
I'm going to take what you were just saying, Andrea, and you, Walt, as principally explanatory of something that really jarred me earlier, Andrea, when you gave the example of Game of Thrones as accessible, sympathetic characters, and the variety and the range of them is something that people were accepting without resistance. In fact, I think in what I've read in reviews as well as discussions, that's one of the principal complaints about both the books and the show is how very difficult it is for so many very similar in character as well as similar in appearance characters be distinguished, and in the fact that they, in both their interior thoughts and in their actions, are so unsympathetic about so many things. So this business that they're providing different perspectives about each other, I think explains why we still read and still watch. But I don't think it comes close to explaining it all. It's to me, one of the more mystifying things about a truly monumental work of art that is being translated so lovingly to the screen, and yet it's so difficult to empathize and to continue to watch because of what the content is.
It's funny, you just put exactly why I put the book down after 100 pages and haven't picked it up again.
I've read several of the books, so I just don't have time. I'm a professor, so I have to read other things. But those books get published. That's actually more what I meant. And get accolades. And get turned into TV shows. Stop. TV shows. So, whereas if you do two characters who are like Redwood and Wildfire, people won't risk it because it's too much. Whereas we will risk that many of those. So that's more what I meant.
Thank you all.
Thank you.